Hey everybody, Optimus Tom here with a casual recap of DreamHack Atlanta's regional championship at Pioneer. Just wanted to take a look at some of the decks that broke out for the weekend, some of the decks that had really good performances, and some of the decks that were a little unexpected in the metagame or had some subpar performances. So of course we need to kick off with the fact that the top 8 was just a pairing of basically four different decks. There was the Rakdos mid-range deck, there was the Azorius control deck, there was the Is It Phoenix deck, and the breakout deck at the tournament, the Abzan Amalia Combo deck. Now, all of these different decks were represented in different ways, and what I have on the screen right here is just a breakdown of all the decks that had a statistically significant amount of decks that were played across the tournament. I can even just kind of scroll on over here. You can see if I move over here that the average of a deck in the tournament was actually 11.8, as that just gets added to a table in Excel, the way that it does work sometimes. But any deck with basically 12 copies or more is represented in this screen right here, and it showcases not only their records, their overall share of the metagame, but also their win rate or their win percent, as how well the deck performed overall as an archetype at the event. Now, of all these decks, the Enigmatic Fires deck actually had the highest win rate of all the decks, which is something that if you follow me on Twitter, I predicted a little bit earlier in the event because I think it stacks up extremely well against the mid-range decks like Rakdos and Is It Phoenix, which were of course very well represented at the tournament as well. Azorius Control, which a Yorion variant, actually wound up taking down the entire event. Spoiler alert, but you know, the event's over now, so no real spoilers. Actually had a fantastic showing as well, and a lot of that has to deal with the fact that the package of the blue-white control deck was extremely well positioned against these mid-range decks, and the Amalia combo deck. Temporary Lockdown is a house in this metagame right now, and Azorius Control being able to basically run four of them in even their main deck is just a very powerful tool that they can use. And we'll take a look at some of these lists a little bit later to see how they actually broke out their 75, or in some cases with the Yorion, 95 cards, or 94 if you don't want to count the Yorion. But the Abs and Amalia combo also had a very good performance this weekend with 55.1% win rate. You can even see by their record just the sheer amount of games that were played. Looking at the total decks that were in the tournament here, Amalia combo actually clocked in second. Is It Phoenix would have surpassed it, but Is It Phoenix is actually broken up into between that and the Grixis variant as well, with 36 decks represented. So the metagame share was a little bit stretched out by adding a third color to Is It Phoenix. It was still, however, the third most played deck at the tournament. Speaking of that Phoenix deck, it was just clocked in just below that 50% mark, which for one of the more popular decks at the tournament, that 50-50 rate is pretty much what you're looking for, especially for one as fair as Is It Phoenix can play sometimes. Some changes to the deck also could have raised or lowered that win rate, which we'll take a look at some of the winning lists a little bit later. Rakdos midrange, the most represented deck in the field, had a sub 50% performance as well, but it's still at that 49.32%, very, very close to where we expect it to be. And we even see 824 wins, 823 losses, so right on the dot for that Jund quote-unquote style fair deck. Some of the other decks we saw were the Quintorius combo deck, below 50% win rate, and Selesnya Angels, which I thought was going to have a stellar performance this weekend, actually had a below 50% win rate as well, and that was mostly because of the emergence of these control decks. So as you can see, the metagame was very varied when you're representing the decks that had a statistically significant presence. Now I want to take a quick look at some of the other decks at the tournament that were just below the threshold. So I'm actually going to go all the way down to having 6 decks represented, because there are 2 decks specifically that I don't think anybody really had on their radar that put up some very good performances at Atlanta. One of them being the top win rate deck at the event, Jund Transmogrify. This list had almost a 61% win rate across 4 decks in the tournament, putting up some of the best results. The other one is the Omnath to Light deck, which a lot of people remember the Bring to Light combos, the different combination of toolbox packages you could run in that deck. Some were running Niv Mizzet. So, this one, however, was not running the titular Omnath with the Bring to Light package, which put up a 54.22% win rate. Some of these decks were playing Up the Beanstalk, which was recently banned from Modern, and some of these decks were not. So we'll take a look at some of the top placing decks from those as we go through the video as well. So looking at the stretching out of just a couple of those decks or underneath that representation mean here, even Boros Heroic putting up a pretty stellar performance, which is very interesting since Boros Convoke was the one that we thought was going to do a little bit better, whereas Boros Convoke unfortunately fell down a little bit more to a 46.58% win rate across the field. Heroic actually had a pretty decent showing this weekend, above 50% win rate. Jumping into some of the decks that were more present at the tournament and did very well. Here is the winning deck list on the blue-white control deck. As you can see, the Azorius control deck played by Daniel Weiser here has pretty stock standard kind of thing. It had the Yorion the Sky Nomad in the sideboard here to make it an 80 card list. That meant that it wound up running a full package of Sharp Typhoons and Omen of the Sea. In addition, we did see 4 temporary lockdowns in the main deck here from Daniel, which was something that we talked about a little bit earlier because a lot of the field is at 2 converted mana costs or less. This is a house against any of the Rakdos sack decks and hits basically anything in the Amalia Combo deck. So the whole package of cards right here was very well suited for the metagame. You actually wound up running more counter spells than I thought were going to happen. Dovin's Veto as a 3 of, Absorb as a 2 of, and 4 Make Disappear were a lot more than I thought. Here, 9 total slots, and if you want to count the Jawari Disruptions as well, which are extra lands, pumping that number all the way up to 11 and 12 with Rewind. Way more counter magic than I thought. These lists were usually packing a lot more removal because you wanted to play to the board as opposed to trying to play on the stack. But this time around, it looked like that the counter magic was actually very, very good. So you get to pack a full 3 Rest in Peace in the sideboard. Chrome Host Seed Shark was also a nice pivot against some matchups specifically where you need to have an extra threat when they bordered out the removal. So the blue-white control deck was looking pretty well positioned for this tournament based off what they had here. The other deck in the finals, Is It Phoenix, had a little bit of a sideboard pivot in some of these matchups. Some of them wound up running Young Pyromancer, others were going for that quote-unquote Spell Pierce Fable kind of tech, where they were running Crackling Drake with Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the sideboard as kind of a pivot game plan to play more of a tempo, almost control-y style Is It game plan. However, the main deck shined with Picklock Prankster, mainly because of the instant adventure, Free the Fae, being able to just look at 4 cards, put an instant or sorcery from them in your hand, put the rest in the graveyard so that you're able to actually just consider, you can keep chaining Picklock Pranksters as well, since you can put a fairy into your hand from there. Some of the lists were playing a Brazen Borrower, so you can get that off of Picklock Prankster and just bounce something that was in the way of your Phoenix's comboing. There are a whole bunch of different things, but mostly it fuels the graveyard for Treasure Cruise, it fuels the graveyard for some of the lists running Dig Through Time, and then some of them are still running the ability to take extra turns with Temporal Trespass. This list, however, wasn't really running any of those. It was just running for value here. We just see the 1 Temporal Trespass with the Galvanic iteration here. So you can fuel Graveyard very early, take a couple extra turns, and just swing it for the skies with those Phoenixes. So Is It Phoenix is still alive and well in this metagame. One of the other popular decks, Rakdos Midrange, actually had 2 variants here. The more traditional one, running Rankener Bankbuster in the main deck, as well as some copies of Archfiend in the draws kind of creeping into these main decks to keep up a little bit extra pressure. And then a second version that was running Inti here, the Essential of the Sun, being able to discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on an attacking creature, and then get a little bit of extra reach by exiling cards and playing them until your next end step. So getting kind of that unlucky witness effect that we get out of the Rakdos Sacrifice decks, and pairing that with Smuggler's Copter, so you're able to just kind of see a ton of cards through your deck, whereas normally you're kind of just only relying on Fable of the Mirror Breaker to do this. This Inti Smuggler's Copter version of Rakdos Midrange was a lot faster and a lot more able to just find what it needed from its deck, because the Rakdos midrange deck has a lot of answers. It just was really about drawing the right ones at the right time, and when you're just looking through potentially 3 cards, even 4 in a turn when you have a Fable on Chapter 2, you're going to be digging through everything you want to find whatever you need. The sideboard plan was just running a lot of low to the ground removal as well. Path to Peril is basically going to be hitting anything in the Amalia deck as well. If you're just 3 mana, you're never really going to be cleaving it. I don't think there's any way to make treasures if you're not running Reckoner Bankbuster, and there's no cheeky one of White Source in the sideboard or anything, but mostly just to clear out tokens from Convoke as well. Same thing for Hidetsugu Consumes All, getting rid of everything will converted mana cost 1 or less, exiling Graveyard, so it's an extra tool against Is It Phoenix as well, and then packing 3 Leyline of the Voids for Rakdos Sac, Is It Phoenix, and Amalia, so the return to the ranks is completely shut off. Speaking of Amalia, the Abzan Amalia combo, the highest placing list in the tournament from that deck here, ran that kind of toolboxy sideboard package. I know I use toolbox like a little bit loosely. It's not necessarily a deck that is just digging for hate bears and trying to find things to disrupt your opponent, but instead it's providing answers and protection for your Amalia combo, which is still pretty much the best way you're going to be winning the game. You have your Amalia on the board, you either get a Wild Growth Walker on the board so that when you explore, you gain life. When you gain life, it triggers Amalia, which explores, and you go back and forth until you blow up the world with Amalia, and then attack for 20. However, you're also still running things like Lunarch Veteran, so you can start the combo by just putting things into play off of Return to the Ranks, or a big old Collected Company putting direct things into play. And then you have a 1 of Dina Soul Steeper, so that every time you gain life, you're draining your opponent or making them lose 1 life as well, which if you have an Amalia and a Dina on the battlefield, even if your opponent is over 20 life, that's almost 40 damage guaranteed. Dina, of course, will continue going off as soon as you gain life off of Explorers, and everything's going to be happening there. So there's of course sometimes that you hit 18 cards off of Amalia. It's very, very unlikely where you just flip all non-lands and like Dina doesn't deal exactly 20 damage, so sometimes you still need to attack with the Amalia. Or if you're playing against something like Selesnya Angels where they have a lot of life and they're in the 30s and 40s, you actually need to swing with Amalia as well. So though it's not 100% guaranteed kill, Dina and Amalia coming together in this deck was a very powerful kind of pairing. And then that sideboard to protect everything. I chose this list out of the top 8 lists as well because Guardian of Faith was in this list, which I thought was very, very crucial in a format that was going to be running temporary lockdown. The ability to phase things out rather than just give them hexproof or indestructible was very key, because temporary lockdown is going to be going around any sort of hexproof or invulnerability that you can give your creatures. So phasing them out and just having them come back into play and then triggering the combo again on another turn. This also protects them from board wipes, which is very important. So having the Guardian of Faith in the sideboard is one of those quote-unquote toolbox options that I think gives this Amalia deck a lot more reach. Gruul Vehicles was a deck that, with the unbanning of Smuggler's Copter, was something that some people were trying out. People had it on their radar as a deck that could potentially do well, but there was also some adaptations to this list that made it a little bit more mid-rangey as opposed to just kind of the Gruul smash that we were thinking of from previous tournaments. Adding Tranquil Frillback was also another card that just gave it a little bit of extra versatility, because not only could you have it enter and do one of these things, but you can pay extra mana you had floating around from all these Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystics to be able to exile an opponent's graveyard, gain some extra life to put yourself ahead into race, and just have all these extra options available to you that would, you know, be able to set you up for things like Rampaging Ferocidon later on, where if you had to start dealing damage to yourself, you were winning a race against a Boros Convoke, or you were winning a race against some mono white humans that were throwing things on the battlefield didn't have that life buffer behind it. Sentinel, the Nameless City, was also a card that popped up a little bit more in these Gruul lists that was just bigger than the other Gruul things that we were usually putting in those slots. It paired alongside things like Bone Crusher Giant very well, so that you had a 4-3 and a 3-4. Reckless Stormseeker, if this thing was able to explore off of map tokens, got out of hand very, very quickly, because suddenly you were swinging with a 4-4 as soon as it entered. If you cracked the map token on top of it on the turn it came into play, it could be a 5-4 just swinging in, and it wound up taking the place of Lovestruck Beast in some of these lists. So we didn't necessarily see Lovestruck Beast all of the time, just having this 5-5 that sometimes derped around because temporary lockdown or something else took away all of the one creatures and 1-drops that were powering it up. But we had Smuggler's Copter coming back in, which made Asika's Chariot pop up a little bit more in some of these main decks. And then, of course, we saw the pairings of the Akroan War and Huntsman's Redemption, which made this Gruul Vehicles, Gruul Saga deck very powerful, kind of mid-rangey choice. The sideboard pretty much stayed the same. There were still people that are running Giganta in the sideboard because you didn't have any double color pips anymore. So Giganta was basically free, and that was a good way to also kind of power through a bit more of this more later game style Gruul deck. One of the decks that I thought was going to do extremely well, and I'm very happy that it proved me right, was the Enigmatic Fires deck. Some of them are running Karuga as a companion, some of them just had Karuga in the main deck. This example, the highest placing list here, which was by Jesus, wound up running Karuga as a companion. And the deck basically just revolved around the engine of using Enigmatic Incarnation, Fires of Invention to put extra things into play during your turn, basically for free, and then utilizing that mana on some of the creatures you would find, such as Kenrick the Returned King, to just gain a ton of value out of this deck. You, of course, had the option to play Elishnorn, Mother of Machines, which in a format where things come into the battlefield and do things is an absolute house, shutting off things like opposing Atraxas, shutting off any sort of Amalia shenanigans that came into play from Enter the Battlefield effect. So this deck was very well positioned against Rakdos, it was pretty good against Phoenix, and even had a little bit of game against those Amalia decks, which is why I thought it was going to do very well this weekend, and it did. Sideboard also meant that since you're playing a deck that's entirely based around enchantment synergies, so that you can sacrifice them to your enigmatic incarnation and kind of food chain your way up into all your threats, 4 Leyline of the Void were basically easy to conclude in the sideboard, which meant that you had extra edge against Phoenix and some of the graveyard-based decks, even Amalia Combo, all of a sudden the return to the ranks are completely shut off, and it let you also, because of the color selection, let you run Unmortigo, which basically meant like, hey, if there were some mono green decks floating around and you wanted to get rid of their Kiora, if you wanted to get rid of their Nykthoses and just completely take them out of the game, you could do that, because it just says choose a card name, doesn't say non-land. Unmortigo lets you pick anything. So this deck was very well positioned, and as we saw from their win rate, even though it had a lower metagame share, it was a very powerful pickup for this tournament. The other deck that surprised some people was the Omnath to Light. I mentioned before, this is just kind of pairing the old Bring to Light here and the Omnath just to get yourself a good grindy mid-range deck. This one probably deserves the toolbox title a little bit more than Amalia's sideboard does, so I'm going to use that here. A little more toolboxy for your different sort of silver bullets. Of course, you could always just Bring to Light for Valky, which then flips into Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter, and just lock your opponent out of the game on as early as possible, you know, maybe turn 4 or something, thanks to Courier's Briefcase and having the ability from Sylvan Caryatid to kind of power out these higher mana cost spells a little bit more consistently. This also had the package of running Bring to Light, in addition to Fable, the Mirror Breaker, and Combat Celebrant. So there was a combo here where you could take basically infinite combat steps by having a non-summoning sick flipped Fable the Mirror Breaker, so you had a reflection of Kiki-Jiki, you have one of your mana dorks like this Sylvan Caryatid did, and you had a Combat Celebrant, so then you would copy Combat Celebrant with Kiki-Jiki, exert the token that came into play by just creating copy with the reflection of Kiki-Jiki. That token gains haste, you exert the token, that untaps all your other creatures, means you untap your Sylvan Caryatid and your reflection of Kiki-Jiki, and you just keep making copies and keep exerting and keep taking as many combats as possible, and you're dealing hopefully 4 damage every single turn, as long as your opponent doesn't have an indestructible blocker in the way or something like that. Up the Beanstalk gave this deck also a ton of value, because every single time you cast Bring to Light, like, hey, that was 5 converted mana cost, you're going to be able to draw a card. This says whenever you cast a spell, so anytime you're playing any of these big things as well, you're going to be able to draw a card. Bring to Light also, most importantly, says that you put the card into exile and you may cast that card. So if you Bring to Light for something that is 5, like a Tulsimir or an Elishnorn, you're going to be drawing an extra card off of your Up the Beanstalk and pairing it with everybody's favorite combination of Leyline Binding to get rid of basically anything your opponent's throwing at you. This deck put up big results in a field that I thought it was going to be a little more harsh against it, but with the Phoenix decks not only being kept down by some of the control decks, but also just the fact that the Phoenix decks were sideboarding into a little bit more of like a control-y and going away from the Phoenix game plan. That kind of meant that the slower Omnath deck could get its feet built up and the foundation strong, so that you're able to just kind of power through some of these games. So 4-color Omnath, it's not going away anytime soon in Pioneer, everyone. The final deck that I wanted to take a look at here from this recap was the Jund Transmogrified deck. This was a deck that kind of took the reins away from the Is It Creativity decks. Very similar kind of game plan, but instead of trying to put a Worldspine Worm onto the battlefield, you're just going for the classic Atraxa value here, mostly because your deck is a Jund deck, and Jund is just going to be having very efficient cards in its 75, so you're able to play things, you know, like a Seeker's Chariot. That's going to get you some board state advantage. Fable the Mirror Breaker, everybody's favorite card. Thoughtseize, you're going to be able to Fatal Push things out of the way. You have Spot Removal. Post sideboard, you have things like Obnixis the Adversary to get you advantages against some of these more controlling matchups. You have Radiant Flames to work as a board wipe. You just have all these very efficient, very useful cards that you're going to be finding off of just transmogrifying into an Atraxa, off of a Courier's Briefcase token, off of a Reckoner Bankbuster creating a pilot, off of the Seeker's Chariot making yourself a cat. After careful cultivation, Basically, you channel that, you discard it, you get a green human that basically is a Llanowar elf, and that, of course, can be transmogrified into a giant flying Vigilance Death Touch Lifelink Phyrexian Angel for that 7 cost. So, Jund Transmogrify was a deck that, if there was more presence, would have been the breakout deck of the tournament. However, there are only 6 copies across the 1,300 people that were playing according to Melee, so the deck didn't necessarily have that breakout standpoint. However, it did have a higher win rate than some of the other decks in the tournament that did hit that threshold, like the Enigmatic Fires deck. So that was just a quick TLDR recap. I say quick, but it was almost 20 minutes. But there was a lot that was going on this weekend at DreamHack Atlanta at the regional championship. Pioneer's in a really great state after Karn is gone. Smuggler's Copter didn't ruin everything as much as people may think. And Caverner Souls, well, it's legal in the format, and Control wound up winning an RC. So if you like your content that you've seen here, of course, don't forget to subscribe to me on YouTube and TikTok at Optimus Tom TV. Hopefully you've enjoyed this type of content, and you can also follow me on Reddit at Optimus Tom for more of your Magic the Gathering needs. See you later.